acrostic on the words THEBOOKROMANS. I gave you 6 general impressions. Let me take it up with this 6th general impression connected with the letter O. Old Testament references. And I reminded you of the fact that the book of Romans contains more direct quotations from the Old Testament than any other New Testament book. And therefore it shows immediately that one of the best ways to study the Old Testament is to study the book of Romans. And as you go through the book of Romans, keep asking the Lord to show you through the study how better to study the whole Old Testament. That's a very important feature of the book of Romans. I told you also that Dr. Graham Scroggie says there are more quotations from the Old Testament in Romans than in all the other epistles put together. I just want to mention one value of Romans in teaching us how to study the Old Testament. One way it teaches us to study the Old Testament is it shows that the basic message of the Old Testament is exactly the same as the basic message of the New Testament. Now, you say, oh, I've heard that before. Yeah, you may have heard it before, but when you study the Bible, often you depart from that. I have to fight the urge not to depart from that. The basic message of the Old Testament is exactly the same as the basic message of the New Testament. Let me give you an illustration of how we disregard that principle. I wonder how many of you refer to the Old Testament age as the age of law and the New Testament age as the age of grace. If you do, then you violate this principle. Sometimes I've asked people who said the Old Testament age is the age of law, the New Testament age is the age of grace, how were people saved in Old Testament times? And their answer is they were saved by grace. And yet, although they say they were saved by grace, they come right back and call the Old Testament age the age of law and the New Testament age the age of grace. Law and grace are not successive principles. Law and grace are contemporaneous principles. They go all the way through together. Let me show you this diagram, which is a very simple one. Here's the idea of law and grace. You have, according to that view, law, Old Testament, and then grace, the New Testament. But here, I believe, is what Romans shows clearly to be the right approach. And that is, in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, you have law. And in the Old and New Testament, you have grace. You see, they are contemporaneous principles. They go all the way through. And the more you study the Bible, the more you ought to see that that thing's true. Now, I received real blessing through being under Dr. Chafer at Dallas Seminary. But Dr. Chafer, I can't recommend in his view of the Old Testament in relation to the New Testament. One statement he makes is that there's no relation whatever between Israel of the Old Testament and the church of the New Testament. Well, I tell you, I just almost lost my mind over that. I thought, well, I've been claiming verses from the Old Testament as my own, and I'm a member of the church. And I can't understand that. So one fellow with me went in to talk to Dr. Ironside on the visiting Bible faculty. And we told him this, no relation whatever between Israel of the Old Testament and the church of the New Testament. And Dr. Ironside said, what I believe to be the right approach is that there are differences between Israel and the church. But although there are differences between Israel and the church, God's covenant people are basically one all through the ages. I see that's very different from the other. For instance, one day in class, Dr. Chafer was talking about Old Testament salvation, and I asked him, Dr. Chafer, how were people saved in Old Testament times? And he smiled in that very friendly way of his. And I believe in that very godly way of his. I know I told Dr. McQuickin once, I can't see some of those teachings, but it looks to me like he's a real man of God. Dr. McQuickin said, of course he's a real man of God. In his own life, he has safeguards which keep him from following those teachings to their logical conclusion. But he gives those teachings to those who do not have those safeguards. And I've seen that reflected in Dallas graduates. Some of Dallas graduates have gone way off the beam. Way off the beam. Not all of them have. Who is that one who died recently who was so used of God through the Bible? Vernon McGee. I think he was just unusually used of God. And he's more dispensational than some of us are. For instance, he says that 2 Chronicles 7:14 can't be preached for us today. If my people who are called by my name will pray and humble themselves and seek my face, then will I hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and will heal their land. How many of you have heard that verse used for us today? He says, no, that can't be used. That's for Israel. See? Well, we part company on that. But I want to tell you, I don't part company with him on his basic thrust. Because I think his basic thrust is the thrust of Dr. Ironside's teaching. That God's covenant people are basically one in all the dispensations. Dr. Chafer was asked, how were people saved in Old Testament times? Well, his answer here was, it's a very difficult question. But one quotation from here that Dr. McQuickin often made was this. I don't say that people were saved by law in Old Testament times. I only say I do not know in what their salvation consisted. See, that was his statement. I don't know in what their salvation consisted. I think Romans makes absolutely clear the fact in what their salvation consisted. Romans 4 says that Abraham was justified by grace the same way we are. And then it comes right back again and it says, David also teaches the same thing. Well, one reason I think of that now is that I didn't use it when I was talking to one of the students. And I said, he was writing a paper on Old Testament salvation, how they were saved. I said, what's your conclusion? And he said, I haven't reached a conclusion yet. I think it's very difficult. And I said, Grant, there are difficulties, but don't you think Romans 4 and Galatians 3 are absolutely clear? Romans 4 and Galatians 3 in saying that they were saved the same way we're saved. He said, no, Romans 4 says Abraham was saved that way. But Abraham lived before the Mosaic law. Well, I didn't have sense enough to check the context of Romans 4, because Romans 4 comes right back and says David also teaches the same thing, and David lived right in the heart and core of the Mosaic economy, right in the heart and core of it. So these folks, some of them are real earnest Christians, and they have safeguards in their lives. Safeguards that keep them from following those teachings to their conclusion. But I will tell you, folks, that whole idea of saying Old Testament age is law and New Testament age is grace has done tremendous harm. It's done tremendous harm. An awful lot in the independent Baptist movement are filled with that. They're filled with that. And they haven't really examined it. And I think some of them might not be open. Again, some of them might not be open because I don't handle it in the right way. You see, and so sometimes I just decide to keep my mouth shut when I'm around them, because I may have said something that offended them later, and I realize, well, perhaps I shouldn't have said that. So somebody else would be the one to help them. But God's covenant people are basically one all the way through. Law and grace are not successive principles. You have law and then you have grace. They're contemporaneous principles. Why is it that the Ten Commandments are permanent? They're permanent because they're the expression of the eternal character of God. God is eternal. And his character is expressed in the Ten Commandments. So you have law and grace. Now watch here. I'm all messed up. Maybe that's the reason the thing wasn't working. I don't know. I thought you didn't put that thing on my belt right. I did that so I could get in the picture and straighten out some of these errors we're teaching. And that last button over with the purple cord in it, see it? Turn it down. There we go. You turned the wrong way. Hurry up, Mike. Good mic going there. Yeah. Good mic, Barry. Yes, sir. Okay. All right, good. You know the thing about Ann, she doesn't know anything more about that than I do. She ought to be ashamed. All right. That's my sixth general impression of Romans. Old Testament references. And one of the best ways to study the Old Testament is to study the book of Romans. You know, you often ask the question, somebody has made a decision for Christ. He's recently become a Christian. Where should you start him in the study of the Bible? Well, you see, you can't give a categorical answer to that, because oftentimes some Bible class is being held, and you take him to that Bible class. Well, where should he start? Where the Bible class is. You see, God leads in terms of that. But you say start him with Genesis. Yes, that's a wonderful place to start if you have time to go through. Well, one of the best places to start is the book of Romans, because it gives you a wonderful introduction to all of God's plan, and particularly his plan in the Old Testament. My seventh general impression of the book of Romans is connected with the letter K. Key epistle. Put a hyphen between the word key, K-E-Y, and the word epistle. Every book in the Bible is a major book. Many don't have that idea. You take Obadiah as the only book in the Old Testament that has just one chapter. But it's a major book. It's not a minor book. You take that expression we often use, minor prophets, can be misleading, because some have the idea, well, they're not as important as the major prophets. No, they're important. Very, very important. Every book in the Bible is a major book. But some books in the Bible are key books in the sense in which others are not. Romans is one of those. Romans is a key book that helps you to understand many other books in the Bible. The first way in which the book of Romans is a wonderful introduction to the epistles. It's a key book because it introduces us to the 21 letters of the New Testament. Is that Romans explains the gospel. Romans explains the gospel. Many have the idea that the four gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are books that reveal the gospel. And they do reveal the gospel, and then the epistles reveal something else. No, the epistles don't reveal something else. The epistles, in more fully developed form, reveal the gospel. You know, we often say, that preacher is a good gospel preacher, but he's weak on the Christian life. That is not true. That is not true. If he's weak on the Christian life, he is not a good gospel preacher. See, the word gospel includes far more than most people include. The whole book of Romans gives the message of the gospel. You take the first verse, Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, a bondslave of Jesus Christ, That's the word servant, and the Greek is doulos, bondservant, bondslave. Paul, a bondslave of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, separated unto the gospel of God. Now see, that's the whole message of the book of Romans, the gospel of God. And one reason Romans is so necessary is it shows that God includes far more in the gospel than most of us do. How many of you have ever heard something like that said, that a certain preacher is a good gospel preacher, but he needs to go beyond that? How many of you have heard something like that? You see, the book of Romans cancels that out. And it shows that if I am a good gospel preacher, then I'm strong on the Christian life. Because the Christian life is a part of the whole message of the gospel. When people are asked, what is the gospel? Often they quote 1 Corinthians 15, 3 and 4. 1 Corinthians 15, 3 and 4 says, preach the gospel, how that Christ died for our sins, according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and he was raised again the third day, according to the Scriptures. They say, that's the gospel. Yes, that's the gospel in seed form. But we need the book of Romans to go into detail what all is included in that. This is the gospel. And I hope nobody here will make that mistake that so many make. He's a good gospel preacher, but I wish he'd go on into the Christian life. He is not a good gospel preacher if he doesn't go on in the Christian life. Romans is a key epistle, and it's a wonderful introduction to the epistles because it explains the gospel. What is the gospel? Somebody says 1 Corinthians 15, 3 and 4. Yes, but now let's take the book of Romans. The book of Romans gives us the breakdown on that. The book of Romans gives us the full development of that. I want you preachers to ask yourselves the question, are you really preaching the gospel? Are you really preaching the gospel? Many think they're preaching the gospel, and they aren't. They aren't really preaching the gospel. The eighth general impression of the book of Romans is connected with the letter O. Objective facts. Objective facts. Let me spell O-B-J-E-C-T-I-V-E. Objective facts. The book of Romans lays great stress on objective facts. Objective facts are facts which are true whether we believe them or not. My faith doesn't make them true. And my unbelief or somebody else's unbelief doesn't make them untrue. Objective facts. And the book of Romans lays great stress on that. Let me give you two illustrations of it. One is Romans 1:18. The introduction of the book of Romans is in chapter 1, verses 1 to 17. Those first 17 verses, the introduction. Then you start with the body of the book in chapter 1, verse 18, in what we often call the plan of redemption, the plan of salvation. And how does Romans begin with the plan of salvation? For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven. Now, we were talking last time about the wordless book and how to present the wordless book. And somebody says you begin with the gold page. All right, now check Romans on that and see. It may be that you'll find in the first 17 verses of Romans something that's in favor of what you say. But the body of the message of salvation doesn't begin with heaven, it begins with hell. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven. Often we say you must get your point of contact first. You have to be awfully careful about those so-called principles. Get your point of contact first, because a lot of that is psychological rather than scriptural. And the point of contact often is something that penetrates a person's heart. I'm not asking you to go out of your way to be unwise, but I tell you, we think we're wise often when we really ignore the way the Bible deals with something. The wrath of God is revealed. Now that's a fact, objective. My faith doesn't make that true. The fact I believe it doesn't make it true. I believe it because it's true. Somebody's unbelief doesn't make it untrue. I heard a preacher say one time that some say they don't believe there's a hell. But he said they will believe it 10 minutes after they get there. That's a solemn fact. That's a solemn fact. If they don't believe there's a hell, they will believe it 10 minutes after they get there. And I imagine even less than that. Man's faith doesn't create a hell. Man's unbelief doesn't change the fact that there is a hell. A man may say he doesn't believe there's any such place as a jail. But if he commits a crime, he's going to be put in jail. He's going to be put in the jail he says doesn't exist. Say, I don't believe there's a jail. When you commit the crime, you'll be put in jail. And folks, it's so important to get these objective facts. The whole Bible is built around that. But you just watch what people say on the radio and television. These talk programs, I don't know how much of the Lord's time you waste listening to some of these things. And how much time I waste listening to some of these things. Often they just disgust me, so I just tune them out. But before I tune them out, more and more God's speaking to me about this. And I'm going to be preparing some messages for Virginia Beach, Chesapeake, Virginia, and I'm going to be giving some messages. Pastor Wood will be preaching the sermon, and I'll be teaching. And I love to have that doubleheader. There are 2 places we go where we have that doubleheader, and I hope it'll lead to more. And in it, I'm going to be teaching the Lord's Prayer. And as I've been studying the Lord's Prayer, I spoke on Sunday night at the church here, and it just comes to me again, my failures in the prayer life. My failures in the prayer life. And you take the media disgusts you often. Let me ask you, how many of you believe that the media is pointed in the wrong direction, that it is biased in the way it reports the news? Yes, I agree with you. I think it is. But now I ask you, how often have you prayed for the media? You raise your hand, all right? Let me ask, how many of you have prayed a good deal for the media that's biased, you think, in the way it reports the news? May I see your hands? I don't see any hands. Well, I've been starting it in a new way. I've done a little of it in the past. But I want to tell you, I've been offended by the media far more than I prayed for them. And folks, that's the real weapon. That's the real weapon. You can talk in favor of one candidate or another, and often it's, in the class every now and then I let the cat out of the bag and let you know I'm a conservative. But I'll tell you, I'm not basically a conservative. I'm a Christian. And I want the Christian view of things, and the conservative view is often quite different from the Christian view. It falls far short. But let me ask you this. How many of you believe that God would have you spend more time in praying for the media that you think is slanted in the wrong direction? Could I see your hands? All right, now I want to remind you this every now and then. I want you to pray for me this year that God will deepen, I mean greatly deepen my prayer life. There's a great need for it. And I've done some of these things from time to time, but I just want my whole life to be a prayer. And I want your whole life to be a prayer. All right, let me give you another illustration of the objective facts in Romans. One is Romans 1:18. The plan of salvation begins with the wrath of God. That's the first great attribute of God in the body of the book of Romans. And then the second illustration of the objective nature of Romans is the 6th chapter. The 6th chapter says that I died with Christ 1900 years ago. I'm a Christian. I know I'm a Christian. And I died with Christ 1900 years ago. Somebody says, when did your life begin? Well, my life began about 81, 82 years ago. Of course, when you think of it, I believe it's true that life begins at conception, 9 months before birth. And so when you figure something like this, you have to add the 9 months to it. But just roughly, my life began 81, 82 years ago. But that wasn't the first event in my life, 1910. The first event in my life took place in 30 A.D. when Jesus died on the cross and was raised from the grave. Because I was nailed to the cross with him. That's an objective fact. And when he went in the grave, I was buried with him. I know Dr. Chafer used to emphasize this, I think so important. He said, books on theology often don't say anything much about the burial of Christ. He died and then he was raised. But he said, I believe there's a theological significance in the burial of Christ. I was buried with him. I was down in that grave for 3 days and 3 nights along with him. And if you're a Christian, so were you. And then when he came up from that grave, I came up from that grave with him. And then when he ascended, I ascended with him. See, these are objective facts. I remember I was struggling in my life as a young Christian. I was talking to Dr. McQuilkin one day in his office. And he said, Frank, what you're trying to do is, you're trying to make these things true by believing them. Your faith doesn't make them true. Christ made them true. See, objective facts. And whenever you read a book on the Christian life, you check it by this. Does it build the whole scheme of prayer or anything else that is teaching on these objective facts that are true just because you're Christian? Your faith doesn't make them true and your unbelief doesn't make them untrue. Objective facts. It used to be when I came to the 6th chapter of Romans, I sort of scowled and I thought, oh, the deeper life. This is over my head. I just can't get into this. The reason why I feared the 6th chapter of Romans was I didn't realize this is an objective fact. It's true. Thank the Lord it's true. You say, I don't understand it. I don't know how much I'm living up to it. But it's true. Your faith doesn't make it true and your unbelief doesn't make it untrue. That's my 8th general impression of the book of Romans. Oh, objective facts. My 9th general impression of Romans is connected with the letter F. Foundational evangelism. Foundational evangelism. I want to mention 2 of the many principles of evangelism which I find in the book of Romans. You know what we mean by evangelism? Soul winning, preaching the gospel. Sometimes people might ask me, as they do, why don't you go along with the Graham Crusades? Well, there are different ways in which I can answer that. One of the simplest answer is I cannot conscientiously support ecumenical evangelism. Ecumenical evangelism is evangelism on the part of those of opposite beliefs. The Catholics and Protestants go together in those meetings, and the modernists and those who claim to be Orthodox go together in those meetings. Those are opposite beliefs. I'm interdenominational. I'm an interdenominationalist. But I just love to go to Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian churches that really believe the Bible. Now, not all of them do, but they really read the Bible, and I'm careful about my associations there. One thing, if you take a real strong stand, you won't get asked back, and you may not be invited in the first place. So that's one way in which I guard this. And God, in His sovereign leading in my life, has led me so that many of these doors are closed. You take, I was brought up in the Presbyterian church. They use the expression, a son of the church. Oh, they lay a lot of stress on that. He's a son of the church. They said that for a while, but then when I went to Columbia Bible College and so forth, they stopped calling me a son of the church. Now, my beloved pastor there was very different from many of the old graybeards. But many of the old graybeards didn't believe that God in His sovereignty has led my life in a certain way. But I'm interdenominational. I love to go to these different ones. We have in our class several Pentecostal preachers. Could I see how many of you are Pentecostal preachers? Let me see now. 1, 2, 3, 4. Keep yeah. 5. Let's see. Who else now? I heard that we were going to have some more come. And if any more come, be sure to have them come up and see me, because I just love to go to those churches. You know, many have the idea that all the Pentecostals are pretty wild and woolly. You know? Well, some are. That's true. And some Baptist churches are wild and woolly. Some of the wildest churches I've ever been in have been Baptist, independent Baptist churches. I mean, some of them are wild. There's no old hillbilly expression I like: wild and woolly, full of fleas, never been curved below the knees. You know? And some of them are wild and woolly. No, but not all of them are, by any means. And I went to one Pentecostal church, and somebody asked me about it. And I said, the only one objection I had was they're too much like the Presbyterians. You know, nobody said